Okay, welcome back. This is the first part of our lecture for Unit 7, and we're talking about the transition from the Baroque, the late Baroque or the High Baroque, all the way to the Age of Enlightenment. And so this is kind of a long lecture, but it's going to be very cursory because it's a very long period of time and a lot of people to talk about. And unfortunately, there will be lots of artists that we don't get to talk about. I skip Claude Lorraine, we skip Franz Hals. There's just so many that get skipped along the way, but this is just to give you kind of a cursory understanding of the shift from the Baroque through the Rococo and through Neoclassicism all the way to what we'd call sort of the end of the Age of Enlightenment. And so there are maybe a couple of main points to start with before we actually start looking at some artists. Number one is that one of the shifts that's happening in the Baroque is that in the early part of the Baroque it was more unified, more consistently similar styles, or at least people were very much focused on that kind of divide between the Caravaggio and Carracci philosophies. Um, Whereas as we move into the kind of post-Rubens world, um, the Baroque art becomes a little bit more diverse, and that diversity is less about shifting of philosophy and more just about difference of situations. That the way it presents itself in the courts of Spain or France is very different from the way the Baroque presents itself in the burgher cities of Flanders or of Holland. And Holland is what we start with, actually. We're going to be talking about two great Dutch painters, but then we will shift along to talk about some other artists. So, yeah, let's start with first these two giants of Baroque painting. Um, Amazingly, they lived quite, quite close to each other in time, and not that far away from each other in geography. Um, and but also at the same time very, very different artists, um, different in a lot of ways and different in their careers. And mostly what we're going to talk about in this lecture is their careers, because of how it kind of says a lot about Baroque art. So we'll start with Vermeer. And Vermeer, although he tried his hand at sort of more ambitious type paintings, things like this allegory, he was mostly focused on smaller paintings, modest sized paintings that were genre paintings. And that's what he primarily made his money at, although we're pretty sure that he made more money selling other people's artwork than he did selling his own artwork. For one thing, because he didn't make a lot of paintings, and so it's pretty clear he didn't make enough paintings to actually support himself. But he made fantastic, gorgeous paintings, and like we've talked about before, amazing sense of composition, very structural and organized around kind of a grid space, and just a beautiful sense of light. But also we are lucky to have a number of studies. Let me also mention that this particular study, The Girl with Red Hat, is not universally attributed to Vermeer, but I'm going to go ahead and continue with the assumption that it is a Vermeer. And one of the things that these smaller works and more study-like works really kind of show Vermeer in the way he looked, and the way he painted, the way he put marks down, um, the way he made decisions about like turning just changes of color into just a simple gesture of his hand of a mark. But they also very much reveal that he probably was heavily influenced by a camera obscura. We don't know for certain whether he used a camera obscura for all of his works. For those of you who kind of missed the time we talked about that in class, a camera obscura is a device like a modern camera, only without film, where essentially you use one lit room and one dark room to essentially project an image onto a canvas that can then be traced, and it is essentially makes it's like a photographic reproduction system only you have to do it by hand. You have to actually by hand mimic the projection. Um, anyway, so at the same time, or pretty similar sort of time, Rembrandt was pursuing his career, and his career was quite different. It took off much better for a while. Rembrandt was very, very successful as a painter, um, and was supporting himself as an artist. But he, unlike Vermeer, he didn't. His success did not last very long. Vermeer, at least his success as an art dealer, maintained his wealth, whereas Rembrandt ended his life much poorer than he was in the middle of his career. Um, and yeah, there's so much to be said about how all the things about Rembrandt's painting. But I guess the main thing I want to point is just the contrast, the difference. Obviously, Rembrandt is much more subdued in color, much more tonalist, much more interested in dark, kind of tenebristic chiaroscuro sort of effects. Um, and he, one of the things I would like to mention about Rembrandt is that he did make a living painting, and a lot of that was in portraiture. And one of the main ways that he made money in portraiture was these kind of large group portraits, like the Night Watch, and this painting here, where it was kind of a specialty of his, and it's a pretty tricky thing to do, to be able to get a group scene with a number of people in it, and get them all to look like pretty reasonable portraits of the individuals. But probably he made most of his money selling prints. We'll talk about the prints in just a little bit. But I also want to emphasize that he did just lots and lots of self-portraits. And in some ways, probably the first artist who really seemed to be interested in the idea of self-portraiture, both as a means of study. With a lot of other artists, we might see one or two self-portraits out of their career. Maybe a lot of them were destroyed, we don't know, but we don't see many. Um, and whereas with Rembrandt, it was really much more of a regular practice. It seems like it was something he did all the time to make himself better as a painter, and that he practiced it and practiced it. But it also seems like he was very interested in the idea of looking at himself in different ways and at different times, so that he had, he owned self-portraits of himself that were from from various ages, and he could see himself as a young man, and he could see himself getting older in his own paintings. Like I mentioned before, he made most of his success as an artist was actually in his prints, and he was a fantastic printmaker, really a master, and this is one of the great ones. And so I wanted to show you this. And later on in this unit, we'll be talking about etching. We'll be talking about printmaking in general, and we'll spend a good deal of time talking about how masterful Rembrandt was at etching, really transformed it as an art form. Last thing I want to say about Rembrandt, and this will be the last of this part of the lecture, part one, is that Rembrandt also did some landscapes, not many, but some like this one, the mill, or there's also one that's of a Jewish cemetery. And they tend to be like this one, kind of dark and a little bit brooding, and they have this sort of pre-romantic spirit. And I want to just talk about that a little bit, because I think it's important to remember when we're looking at art history that it's not all about contrast. It's not all about change from one style to another style. Like later on in this lecture, for this unit, we'll be talking about the shift from the Baroque to the Rococo, and then the Rococo back to this kind of to neoclassicism, and then later on we'll talk about from neoclassicism to romanticism. But it's also interesting to see that there are hints of continuity all the time in art. And so even deep in the Baroque, we see the glimmers, the beginnings of romantic thinking in terms of picture making, and in terms of thinking about mood. And I really feel like this is one of those Baroque paintings that definitely captures that idea. it is definitely, to me, romantic in spirit. But that said, I would never describe it as a romantic painting because it's not from the Romantic period. Okay, that is the end of part one, and just